wanted to say welcome to all of you who have joined us. We're just so grateful that you are on this webinar with us today, and we have the opportunity to talk together about caring for kids who have gone through difficult events. We are aware that this is something that's important to each one of you, and just are thankful for your investment of time in this discussion. Kids are facing significant events day by day around the world, and coming alongside as caregivers and parents and support folks in their life in effective and compassionate ways is really important. So we're just going to talk through a few housekeeping things for the webinar, as is common. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted publicly in conjunction with the second webinar that we will be doing. And so if you want to turn your camera off, if you want to adjust your name, you're more than welcome to do that. We just wanted you to know that this link will be publicly posted, paired together with the second webinar we're doing in August. I also wanted to point out that we are doing a second webinar where we will be digging deeper into some of these tools and resources. And there's a QR code at the bottom of your screen there that you can find the registration link, and we'll show that again at the end. We'll be covering some more practical tools, and today is a bit of an overview. We'll be diving a little bit deeper in that second webinar in August, so feel free to check that out.
So we ask all the participants throughout the webinar to keep your microphones turned off, just so we don't have a lot of talking over each other. The four of us do that enough, so we'll try to keep it to just the four of us presenters. And then submit your questions. If questions come up, submit those in the chat. We will try to get to those at the end of the webinar. We may or may not get to them. If we don't get to your questions in this webinar, look forward to part 2. We will be taking all of those questions, anything that we didn't get to from the first time we did this webinar, this one, and then future, you'll have a chance also as you register for part 2 to submit additional questions. We'll be taking all of those into consideration as we put together part 2 of this series. And then links as well will be posted in the chat. Any resources that we refer to that we have links that we can give you, we'll post those right there so you can grab them quickly.
And those will also go out after the webinar wraps. Within the next 24 hours or so, you'll get an email with the recording from this webinar if you want to listen to it again, as well as links to each of the resources that we touch on today. Prior to the webinar wrapping, just a few minutes prior, in your inbox, you will get an email with just a short survey. It'll take a couple of minutes to fill that out. And if you receive that survey, you will for sure receive the second email with the recording link. But we know sometimes folks, spam filters kick the emails out. So if you don't receive that email, you will definitely not receive the second one with the resources. So please let us know if you don't receive the survey email, and we will send that to you directly, as well as the webinar link and recording.
So before we get into introductions, we wanted to take a minute to just describe why we did this webinar and why we're here. The first one is that it's really hard to argue with the fact that childhood trauma is on the rise, and events that cause trauma, the world's not getting calmer and less dangerous. There's more disasters, there's more abuse, there's more of all the things that create traumatic reactions in kids and adults. With that, also with a lot of the training and the travel that Josie and I have done around the globe, probably the most common question that we're asked is what do we do for kids? Because so much of the training is geared toward how to help adults, which is okay. That's needed also, but this is probably the most common question we're asked.
And there's more and more research connecting adverse childhood experiences to resilience and coping strategies as adults. And we're just so grateful to have experts from Mercy Ministries with us today to just collaboratively discuss what we can do to come alongside kiddos who are in crisis or who have experienced critical events in the past, to help build their resilience and add to their coping strategies toolbox. Collaboration is a core value of both of our organizations, so it's just really fun to be able to host this kind of a webinar together. Scott and I are the co-founders and executive officers of the Resilience Resource. We have a team of about 15 that provides crisis care, consulting, workshops, and equipping for individuals, communities, and organizations around the world, most who are experiencing the flashpoint of crisis or critical incident. We do a lot of immediate aftermath of care, as well as equipping for crisis care toolboxes, just helping those groups, individuals, communities, and organizations develop a holistic culture of people care, really building that opportunity for people to thrive and flourish in their roles. We both have a master's degree in leadership development. I'm getting ready to start a PhD in faith and resilience. We've been in the humanitarian aid development and missions world for over 20 years now, doing this kind of work, caring for people who've gone through crisis and trauma. And our team is also involved in this world and has been for a good number of years. And it's just a joy to partner again with Mercy Ministries. And we know that their breadth and depth of experience is just so valuable and really something important to add to the conversation. So we'll turn it over to you, Diane and Melanie. Can you just give us an intro of yourselves and just maybe a little sample of your experience and expertise?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Josie and Scott. And it's we're just feel very privileged to have this invitation and this time to share together. And I really want to say huge thanks to everybody who's on the call, because I know it's because you care about kids, and that is our passion as well. So we're really looking forward to this being a great time of sharing together. So Diane Pulver-Miller and I lead an organization, Mercy Ministries, that has been working with orphans and orphanage survivors for over 20 years. And our primary area of focus has been Romania, but we also come alongside foster parents, adoptive parents, other organizations that work with kids who have had early childhood trauma in their background. And along with that, both of our families have also adopted young men. They're young men now. They were teenagers when we adopted them, who come from the orphanage system in Romania. So besides planning programs and supporting others, we kind of know what it's like to walk the walk day by day with kids who have a lot of severe trauma in their background. And we're really passionate about coming alongside other families, because it's a hard journey, but also very rewarding. We also have backgrounds as teachers in elementary and preschool education. And so that's another passion of ours, is just bringing this trauma-informed lens into educational spaces and making it safer and more productive for kids who have that kind of background, even while they're at school.
Yeah. Thanks, Mel. A little bit more about us. We also both have a master's degree, Mel in education, myself in psychology. And as we kind of began leading Mercy Ministries, I believe it was in 2013, we began to notice so many of the young people that we've been working with for years who are aging out of the system. Maybe we're getting some help with housing and food and even finding a job. They were losing the jobs. They could not hold the housing. They were making really poor relationship decisions. And we realized and understood this was from their trauma background. So we knew a little bit about this, decided to get ourselves a little more educated. So we both are practitioners in trust-based relational intervention, TBRI, which, if you're familiar with that, it's through the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development through TCU. And then we were blessed and lucky enough to be trained by the Trauma Center in Boston with Bessel van der Kolk, who is the author of The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't read that one, that's kind of what we call our trauma Bible. So we would highly recommend that one. So that's us, and let's dig into our material here. Scott and Josie, to get us started, can you help us understand what we're talking about, what we mean when we talk about trauma?
Mhm. Yeah, I love that you recommended the body keep score, because something that we highlight with the definition of trauma is that it is a whole body response. And it's so important to define the terms that we're going to be discussing so that we're just on the same page, or the commonality of language. And the word trauma is tossed around in a variety of spaces, in a variety of conversations. It's become something that's very normalized to discuss. And it's technically a clinical term, but we're grateful that it's become part of the everyday language, because it is important to bring that to the forefront. But it's really based on the reactions of individuals, again, a whole body response, a whole body reaction to events, to experiences that people have gone through.
So a lot of times we'll refer to events as traumatic events. That's really a kind of a deceptive misnomer, because the events are not traumatic. What creates trauma is subjective to the individual because of their chemical makeup and their reactions to an event. This is why Josie and I were firefighters for a number of years. We could go on one car accident and see a person that's goes to the hospital and is checked out and is physically okay, and they're just driving the next day just fine. And we'll see almost the exact same mechanism of injury for another person, and they're scared to drive for years. This is why there's that difference in reaction. For one person, it's traumatizing; for another person, it's not. So the event itself is not what's traumatic. Trauma is defined by the reactions to an event.
And it's typically an event that overwhelms somebody's typically effective coping strategies, and often characterized by extreme fear and helplessness, but not always. And so again, it's important to go back to that reality that it's a reaction, it's a symptom from the individual, and from a whole body level, internal and external. It typically outlasts what we consider the stress reactions of an event. So it's something that has a symptom or a reaction that's longer lasting. And it's not actually memory. It's something that's in the real and present time. Mel and Diane, can you guys help us understand a little bit more about trauma, and maybe even specifically how it could impact younger children?
Yeah, that was a great definition and a great place to pull us all together and get us started. And I think in addition to what you guys just explained, it's really important to realize that there actually are additional levels of trauma. And when you think about it, they kind of layer on top of each other, kind of like a cake, if you will. There's layers there. And kind of the next layer up would be this idea of complex trauma. And the difference being that complex trauma is relational and it's chronic. So think of something like intimate partner abuse, can often be human trafficking. Oftentimes that's done with somebody who knows you or gets to know you, child abuse. And it involves that power imbalance. So there's somebody who has power over you. And it's usually in the context of a significant relationship. And when we think about trauma that happens like that, it really it affects your ability to regulate all your emotional states. Your nervous system becomes completely dysregulated. Your alarm system, which is the sympathetic part of our nervous system, is always on. And it really leads to some significant trust issues. I mean, think about that. If you have somebody, for example, if you're a child, you have to rely on that caregiver. You have to trust them. And if they're the one causing the trauma, how could you ever possibly trust anybody else for the rest of your life? And we know, especially in children, that having a trusted adult to return to in a traumatic situation is a main factor for resiliency.
Yeah, it's so true that trauma that is caused by somebody you should be able to trust just adds complexity to the recovery process for children. And we also know that if this trauma happens during early childhood, during really important developmental period of early childhood, that there's going to be additional challenges for children. So we talk a lot about complex developmental trauma or early childhood trauma, and that is things like abuse and neglect that happens in the first couple of years of life, abandonment, being raised in an institution during those early years where you're not getting the caregiving attuned to what your needs are as a young child is also going to add extra layers of complexity. It really affects the brain itself as it's developing. And we've really come to see this as a kind of brain injury, similar to somebody who maybe has some kind of a physically traumatic event where they hurt their head or they have a stroke or something like that, because we know it affects the developing brain. Now, the good thing is the brain is malleable, and we know that new neurons can always be connected and things can change. And of course, that is our hope as caregivers working with these kids. But I think it's super important just to kind of know where they're coming from and to know how big the impacts are. So that's going to really affect a lot of sensory processing and a lot of the way our nervous systems work. And so in typical trauma, like a situational kind of trauma like PTSD, often it's triggers from the past that kind of set off a reaction. But for people that have had complex trauma, or especially kids who have experienced, or adults who experienced it as kids, early childhood trauma, it's almost like this trauma response is baked into your nervous system. And that alarm that, I often think about a deer running from a lion, that's a trauma kind of response. You have to get away. It's like that alarm is almost constantly on. So for kids that have had this kind of background, they are going to be very hyper vigilant. They're going to see danger where other people would not see danger. Those are going to be the kinds of things that really get in the way of their emotional regulation, of their flexibility to be able to just withstand, the everyday stresses of life are going to just be that much more magnified for them. Also, if you have early childhood trauma, it has affected your attachment to a primary caregiver, which again is going to affect all your later relationships in life. So really, these kids that have had early childhood trauma, they've had to pretty much learn how to survive on their own. There haven't been trusted adults that help them learn how to regulate their emotions, how to react to the outside world. But at the same time, they have fewer skills to fall back on, because you learn those skills for regulation by having an adult who's attuned to your needs. So impulse control can be really difficult. Cause and effect thinking can be difficult. Those are some of the things that we're going to see in those situations. And I'm wondering, Scott and Josie, if you could build on that a little bit. I talked a little bit about some symptoms we might see, but could you fill that out a little bit more, and all different kinds of trauma and what we might see in kids?
Mhm. Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum of responses that you might see in the flashpoint of a crisis. And I think it's important to affirm, what you were saying about how early childhood experiences shape our response in the present. We really, even our whole life long, we bring to the present what we have experienced in the past. And that shapes how we view what we're going through today. And that happens across the board. And when you do have some of those specific adverse childhood experiences on board, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about adverse childhood experiences. But when you have some of that on board, just like you mentioned, Mel, with the attachment issues, or somebody who has actually had a relational betrayal experience in their life, it does make it so that it's difficult for them to connect with community or to find support in relational connection, which we know is foundational to resilience. Having that connection with another human being is something that really builds our resilience and allows us to apply coping strategies to what we're going through today. But when you are caring for a kiddo that's experiencing the flashpoint of crisis, there's a range of symptoms that might be observed. And we've popped a list in the chat that's got a holistic emphasis to those symptoms.
So symptoms will vary widely. Because people are different, they have different chemical compositions, they have different chemical body responses when something happens. The reactions then will be widely different. So we will give you some of the most common ones that we see in kids, but understand that this is not a checklist for, oh, my kid is experiencing 2 of these, but not all 4, so they must not be traumatized. No, look beyond the ones we're going to give you. In your list is like so many lists that you might find if you Google this on the internet, which is characterized toward adults. And you will find that in most of those categories, kids respond very similarly to adults. Will kids have anger response? Of course they will. Will they have mental capacity being diminished or accelerated? Sure. But how that manifests and the behavior is very, very different from adults. So think of it that way. Also, children very well, depending on developmental stage, usually don't have the same language that adults have to describe what they're feeling and their emotional responses, which can be crazy making for adults, because adults are left going, how do I pick up the pieces of a kid who has changed dramatically in their behavior and I don't know what's going on and they can't tell me? So keep in mind that language, again, and language will be a problem, but as a child develops through adolescence, through their pre-adult years and into adulthood, it will start to, well, hopefully it will start to develop into where they can be more verbal about describing these things. Until then, we have to probe and see and be able to communicate on the child's level.
And again, this isn't for the purpose of diagnosis. It's simply to identify what's presenting in front of you so that you can provide empathetic and compassionate care. Sometimes we fall into a bit of a temptation of thinking, oh, kids are super resilient, they're coping great, I don't have to be really intentional about providing care for them because they're just going to kind of navigate this situation however they navigate this situation. And the purpose of the list is to bring forward an assessment process that allows you to ask some questions surrounding behavior, surrounding coping strategies, and really be curious about why some of these symptoms and reactions are presenting the way that they are. And you might see things like regression in age-appropriate behavior. So maybe a child has achieved some age-appropriate milestones like potty training or sleeping through the night, or maybe a greater level of independence if they're a teenager. And some of those age-appropriate milestones regress to a couple of years younger, where you might see a kiddo that can no longer sleep through the night, or a kiddo that starts wetting the bed again, or maybe is so distracted that some of the things that they were really responsible for and did well with previously, they just don't have any intentionality or focus on anymore. Sometimes there's some acting out, aggressive behavior, or maybe even withdrawn or much more internal behavior. And it's the thing that we encourage caregivers or parents to be aware of is something that's a shift from where that child was typically. So what was their kind of day by day, their stable rhythm, and what are you seeing different? And if you're seeing something different, if you're not aware that there's a specific flashpoint of crisis that you can kind of point to, or an event you can point to be curious about why this shift has happened. And again, we can tend to fall into a reactive response when kiddos change something that's outside of what has been kind of a stable rhythm for them. And the point of these kinds of lists and the assessment process is to encourage that step back, that ability to be present with kiddos from a place of safety and curiosity.
So one of the things that I love about Mercy Ministries, and I think is really unique to your organization, is that you didn't stop at the childhood trauma. And I think when a lot of people hear we've done orphan care for a long time, immediately our minds go to these are really young kids. And they start out that way, yes, but they don't stay that way. They continue to grow. And Mercy Ministries has followed the same kids who are now, from when they were institutionalized in the orphanages to now in their early 30s, and is still providing care for the same group of kids. So with that in mind, build on this a little bit for us. What stuff have you seen? What reactions and what layers complicate the situation?
Yeah, I want to actually build on something that you were talking about, Scott, and that is one thing that makes it difficult for kids in crisis is their verbal processing is not as developed as it is for adults. And I mean, that's probably true for all kinds of trauma, especially true if it's been early childhood trauma. But kind of as we pivot to not just like what are the bad things that have happened, but how can we make positive interventions here? There's something really encouraging just about the way trauma works that does give us an open door to walk through. And that is that trauma really is about the present moment. And we always talk about there being two foundational touchstones whenever you're thinking about how to respond to trauma. And that is that trauma is in the present and it's in the body. So just focusing on that first one for just a little bit, because trauma is in the present moment, it is not a memory of a bad thing that happened in the past. If it was just a memory, then then the person would have already processed it and they would actually not be having those traumatic responses. That's kind of like the goal where we want to get to. But by the very nature of it being trauma, it's because it still is causing reactions in the present. And that actually means that there's a lot of ways that we can intervene and help start this healing journey without having to go back to the past, get the kid to talk about it. Like, I'm not a psychotherapist, that's not my training. And actually, I've had a lot of psychotherapists tell me that they can be part of the healing process for trauma, but it's almost never the place to start. So I always like to tell those of us who care about kids and are not clinical psychologists, this is a really hopeful thing. It means that families, teachers, others involved in the community, other leaders can make such a huge difference for kids. You don't have to have a psychology degree. Of course, there are times to really seek out that extra layer of professional intervention, but really the place to start is in the present, because the nervous system is dealing with whatever situation is around them, like the trauma is still happening. So just be aware of that. For somebody who's having a trauma response, they're feeling the same feelings. They're having the same reactions that they had during the original trauma, even if they can't remember it because it happened when, you know, maybe their mind has just blocked it out, or maybe it happened when they were really young. And again, with anybody who's had chronic trauma, early childhood trauma, this really is just kind of a way, it's a new normal, really. It's a way of reacting in the world. So I just like to really remember, it's our job as people who come alongside kids who have experienced trauma. We just have to deal with the symptoms that are in front of us, with the kid who's in front of us. We don't have to go back to the past. We just need to have great ways to walk alongside them, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this time here together. But things that we can do in the here and now with the kid who's kind of right here in front of me.
Right. And as Mel talked about, the second part of kind of these touchstones that we always keep in mind when working with someone who's experienced trauma or training others who are working with those who have experienced trauma is to remember that trauma lives in the body. This is not some kind of out there psychological construct, if you will. It actually is very grounded in our bodies. So we talked about earlier, especially with early childhood trauma, complex trauma, it changes your brain, it changes your body. You can look at things like heart rate and breathing respiration. They'll be different for somebody who actually has experienced early childhood trauma as opposed to someone who has not. And they have discovered this through a lot of the new technologies they have nowadays. So when we're there in the present with this child, what can we do? Think about body-based activities, right? If trauma lives in the body, then the place to start is in the body. And we, as Mel had talked about, we don't have to have specialized training for this. A lot of that talk therapy, if you will, or psychotherapy is super helpful and can either come later in the process or you can walk alongside. But we want to start with those body-based activities that can really help the person in the present moment. And we hopefully will get to some of those today. If we don't, we're going to give a lot of those practical body-based suggestions in the second seminar, second webinar. So don't forget to sign up for that one. So kind of now that we know a little bit about trauma and its manifestations and what to look for, Scott and Josie, what do you guys tend to focus on first? What do you look for and what's important to focus on?
Well, I love that you talked about the emphasis on trauma being in the body and that physiological reaction. You know, certainly we also advocate for the perspective of the whole being, recognizing that all of these things are integrated. A response is going to be physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. But stabilization of the child and the adults surrounding the child in the situation is so important because as we know, kiddos, they observe the world around them. That's part of their learning process and their growing process. We do it as adults, but it tends to be maybe a bit more in our subconscious. But kiddos are watching to see how they're supposed to respond, what's safe in their environment, and they'll mirror the adults around them. So stabilizing the child and the adults, doing the best that you can to be, if you're a caregiver coming alongside or a parent, to be the non-anxious person in maybe what might feel like an anxious situation. And the way that we can do that for ourselves and the child is through what we call some stabilization and grounding techniques. And these are things that are primarily at a sensory level, a physical level, things that engage the five senses, that work to regulate our breathing and our heart rate. And the resource that was just popped in the chat contains some options or suggestions for how to go through that with kids.
Some additional ones that aren't on the list that we just gave you, though, are hand a child something, a sour candy or a peppermint, get their taste re-engaged. Because one of the things that when someone starts to have trauma reactions, their senses get tunnel visioned, meaning that their body eliminates all the senses that don't matter for survival in the moment. So if we can re-engage some of those extra senses, we can reattach the mind to reality. And that's part of the goal. So those strong flavored candies to just hand a child and say, hey, what does that taste like? Followed up with a question so they actually have to think about, wait, what do I actually taste?
Because a
or-
child that's experiencing a trauma response has gone to the reactive side
Right.
of their brain. That is that point of bringing the trauma to the present. And the stabilization and grounding techniques help to bring the cognitive side of the brain back into play and allow that child to start to calm those distress survival symptoms that have really flared up or have responded to something that they are feeling in the present.
And remember that we've described them as reactions, and they're just that. They're not choices that a child is making. They are reactions. So we're looking to interrupt a reaction cycle that's very easy to start, where a child has a traumatic reaction. I react to their reaction, then they react to my reaction, and then I react. And there's this cycle of we're all reacting to each other's reactions, and none of that is helpful in the moment. So we're looking to interrupt that reaction cycle. And instead of me reacting to their reactions, let's find a third way. I'm going to handing a child a piece of candy when they're acting out in socially unacceptable ways. A lot of adults find somewhat counterintuitive. The last thing I want to do is hype them up on sugar. Remember that this is just in the moment, and we're trying to just interrupt that reaction cycle.
Well, part of what we're doing, even before we're employing stabilization and grounding tools, is creating a sense of safety. We're really assessing the environment that's around us. And, there's such a range of situations where we could be caring for a child that's in distress, everything from we came upon a car accident, we're caring for a victim right there in the moment, to we're actually present with a family that we know well, or maybe it's one of our own children who is having some kind of a trauma reaction, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. But recognizing that and keeping in mind that whole safety perspective. So physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. Are there things that could cause physical danger in this present environment? Do I need to move a child out of this environment because their safety is in question? Or is there a situation that maybe is emotionally, mentally, or spiritually unsafe? Is there a way that we can assess what's going on here to the point that we're creating a sense of felt safety? Maybe this child is feeling at risk from others in their environment, that there's been a situation of bullying or abuse, and they're not feeling safe to be able to regulate and be able to get back into the cognitive side of their brain. They're really in a survival mode. And that's where that fight or flight kicks in. But Mel and Diane, could you go a little bit deeper? I know that the concept of felt safety is something that we've discussed a bit and is something that you really emphasize as well.
Yeah, I mean, felt safety really is foundational for us and for where we start with anybody that we're working with. And I do want to throw in real quick here, especially if we have anyone on the call who may be outside of the States, or really even within the States, but a lot of this stuff we'll talk about with felt safety can be impacted by the culture that you're in. Something that's acceptable in one culture for a child to do may not be acceptable in another culture. And often we have that on top of everything else. So keep that in mind as you're working, especially if you're in a culture that is not your original culture. Get to know what that is, understand what the norms are, and what is considered acceptable and not acceptable. That said, felt safety, probably the most important thing that we start with. When we come into a situation like that as a helper or a caregiver, we know we're safe, right? We know I'm a safe person. I'm here to help you. That's what I'm here to do. But the child may not know that. They may not know it's safe. And especially if that child has an additional complex or complex developmental trauma, that's going to take a lot longer to get that felt safety established. It's a lot harder. One of the things I tell people all the time is you can't give up, and you can't take it personally. It's not about you. This is about them. So we really have to distance that from ourselves. I always think about when we first started with our young people in Romania, one of the very first things that we were doing with them was running camps. and people would come, new volunteers would come. And if you had anything, let's say even just off the top of my head, physically about yourself you didn't like, oh man, those kids would focus in on that and, you know, just run with it. And we just really had to be, hey, this is not, they're calling me fat, whatever. It's not, this is not about me. I have to be able to let that go and see how that is a protection for themselves, right? So we can't take it personally. So all that said, how do we establish felt safety? One, I think one of the most important things is that this role of the idea of play. And you can do play with adults as well, but we're, you know, talking about children here. It's really hard to be scared, to be afraid if you're playing. And play is bigger than just, you know, maybe what we, the small concept of play we have in our mind. Play includes this idea of humor. So if you can get down on a child's level and welcome them with more of a sing-song kind of voice, if that's culturally appropriate, even small little things like, hey, I love those sneakers you have, that you, they're my favorite color, something like that. Anything you can maybe do a little later on in the introduction process that's more of a give and take kind of a play thing, that also gives the child a voice. And it gives them a voice possibly non-verbally. Mel had talked earlier, and you guys had too, about how that language thing can be so difficult, not just developmental language, but actual, you know, different languages. This is something that can be just very done with your body, a back and forth kind of thing, but it gives them that voice without actually having to verbalize what's going on, what's wrong, even having to verbalize it all. So anytime you can incorporate some kind of a play or a little bit of humor, a great place to start for felt safety. And I think Mel knows has a couple more she wants to share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I really, really want to encourage any families, or anybody who's on the call who like has kids in your family that have gone through traumatic situations, or if you're coming alongside families and helping to empower them, how important this can be, because often with kids who've had trauma, because they're so emotionally dysregulated, then there's a whole lot of behaviors that come out of that drive us crazy, and we can get into this thing where we're just barely coping day to day, trying to and we can kind of get into a mindset where it's about how to redirect the behaviors. We become very focused on and which can be become very punitive, or it's all about the discipline. How do I get this behavior that really is not working for this kid and this family? How do I get this behavior to stop? And obviously that is something we need to work toward. But I think what can happen in the process is we become so focused on the behavior that we kind of we can lose the joy as a family. We can lose the ability to play together because we're just trying to survive as a family. We're trying to get this kid to, you know, change something that is not working in our family. But I just can't say enough, try to find times that you can create playfulness as a family every single day, and realize it's therapy. Like, I mean, I think that can help a little bit. You may not even feel super great about that kid right now and want to play together, but if you can see it as therapy and healing, it's not just play, it is part of the healing process. And another area that we can really focus on is the role of choice, because if we can give choices to kids in ways that still work for us as parents or as leaders of an organization, then we're helping to empower them. And that really is counteracting really what trauma is. I mean, trauma really is a situation where somebody took your choice away, somebody in power over you caused something to happen to you that was super scary and super dangerous. And so kids can be left feeling very helpless. And anytime we can give kids choices in even little itty bitty things. Again, it seems insignificant, but we kind of have to reframe it in our mind and realize this too is therapy. So, and it doesn't have to even cost money. I mean, it can be little things like, do you want to put your left sock on before your right sock? Where do you want to sit in the room if we're working with a group of kids? If we're getting a snack together, we always try to make sure there's at least 2 choices of a snack so the kids can pick one or the other. Little simple things like that, and like go overboard with it to the point where you're just like, okay, I'm always giving choices all the time. Realizing that again, this is part of the healing for that kid, because it just gives them that little bit of sense of, I can take care of myself, I can make sure I'm safe. And the other part of that is somebody's listening to me, somebody's listening to my voice, somebody cares about me. And that again is what builds that felt safety, and the felt safety is the foundation for everything that kid can build on in terms of healing. And I'm really glad you guys popped in that in the chat just a few minutes ago, that article called the three pillars of healing. One of them is felt safety. Again, keeping in mind, it's not about is it safe or not. We as adults are going to really try to make sure it's safe. The hard part is for the kid to feel like it's safe. So that's where we have to kind of realize how much we're battling. Routine can also be super important for kids. And, sometimes we're in a crisis, especially if it's a real critical crisis kind of situation. The whole thing that's hard is that the routines have been disrupted. If we're in a situation of trying to get away from a war or trying to get out of a natural disaster kind of thing. So just looking for ways that you can build routine in any way you can, knowing that obviously, things have been disrupted. Putting a kid down to bed, always, we always brush our teeth and then we sing this song. And then, we have a special little hand signal and we give them this stuffed animal or, whatever the routine is, you do it over and over and over. Those can just be things that kids can really latch onto to feel safe. And then relationship is really, really foundational. And it's hard because part of what trauma takes away is your ability to trust other people often. And so I want to emphasize again what Diane was just saying about not taking things personally, because even though what these kids need is relationship, often traumatized kids will do everything they can to sabotage relationships, to push people away, because it doesn't feel safe. And so to be that safe person, we just have to really think it's not about me, it's about the trauma this kid has been through. We often, Josie and Scott talked about how we've really committed ourselves to stay in the long term with these people who are now young adults, started out as young children. So many disruptions in the relationships along the way. You just expect that, that, and then that we'll give them a choice. We often say, I'm not going to force you to be with me today. I'm going to give you the choice, and I just want you to know, even if you don't want to be with me today, I'm not going anywhere, and I will be here when you are ready to re-engage. And when they see that kind of stability, that you're, first of all, you're not forcing anything on them, you're giving them choice, and that you are there for the long term. That does create a lot of safety and then healing over the long term. So just some things to keep in mind. And again, something as silly as play may just realize there's a lot more packed into that, and that is the healing journey. I alluded a little bit to some of the disruptions that can happen based on trauma, some of the ways kids can push us away. And I'm wondering if Scott and Josie, you could dig into this whole concept of behavior a little bit more, and kind of how we react to what we would term bad behavior and how trauma plays with that.
Yeah, I think it's just want to emphasize how important it is to highlight those aspects of play, choice, routine, and relationship. And when you are faced with problematic behaviors, it is those things that are going to create stability and grounding. Kiddos really do well when they know what to expect. And oftentimes the problematic behaviors are something that's arising out of a fear, out of something that's basically internal, that says, I have to take control of this situation because I don't know what's going on. And so for my own survival, I need to dictate this. And we can kind of name those things as problematic behaviors. And what we're encouraging and advocating for is to see those as something that can be more rooted into a reaction to something deeper, or an experience that a child has had in their past. And just, it was so important that you identified and recognized, Diane, the cross-cultural aspects to this, because every culture has a way that they define a family, what a family should look like, or how a child should behave, maybe within the constructs of family, or even within the social environment that they're a part of. And we can tend to put kids in a box a bit and say, well, this is a problematic behavior because it doesn't comply with social or cultural norms, instead of going, actually, there might be something more deeply rooted here that we need to pay attention to. And just because a child is acting outside of social or cultural norms, it's not about me. I can't try to control this child's behavior because I'm embarrassed for what they're doing. I have to be willing to step outside of what I expect or am maybe asking of a kiddo, and approach more with curiosity and less from a position of maybe even self-embarrassment for what a child's doing.
I totally concur. And there's even taking that a step further, we can't just be about stopping behavior. We have to, when trauma reactions happen, there's this energy buildup. We know that adrenaline dumps through the system and creates an energetic response. Now, that could be energy directed at other kids, and all of a sudden a child is hitting other kids on the playground. Well, that's not a socially acceptable behavior at all. But instead of going, sit in the corner and stop moving, understand that that's going to be almost impossible for that child. They can't just stop the behavior. So instead, look at reframing and redirecting behavior. Redirect that energy towards something that's benign, or even better, something that's beneficial, and teach the child how to cope with that energy dump in ways that are socially acceptable. So instead of, we can't be hitting other children, that's not socially acceptable, but we can pick up this kickball that the kids are playing with on the playground, and we can bounce it as high as we can and do it over and over until that energy's out. That's socially acceptable. We can even make a game and start to play with and see who can bounce this ball the highest. So we can channel that energy into more productive ways. These are not, I'll say this again, and probably if there's one thing that I want you to walk away from this whole webinar with more than anything else, these are not choices of behaviors that kids are making. They're just reactions that they cannot control. When you ask children to describe them, they won't describe them as I'm mad usually. They'll usually describe something physical that's discomforting. My tummy hurts. My body aches. They're expressing the physical, even though underneath the physical, the reason that physical reaction is happening is because of the stress and the trauma that they're re-experiencing. So focus on reframing behavior instead of stopping it. And then also take the word bad behavior kind of out of your vocabulary, because it changes the way we look at the child. If the child is always doing bad behavior, eventually in our mind, they become a bad kid. And that is a terrible label to have on a child, and a terrible mindset and posture to have toward the child for a long-term future. So remember that they might not be acceptable, but they're not bad behaviors. We're just redirecting energy.
So something to, on the flip side of that, to keep in mind is that there's oftentimes a way that kids respond that feels acceptable to culture as a norm. They have put in masking strategies or masking as a coping strategy. And so you actually have a child who has gone through a crisis or a critical incident and you go, oh, they're doing great. Like there's no response whatsoever. They just seem like they've just kind of sailed right through this and there's no symptoms on board. And keep in mind that kids do have a survival component that can mask some of these symptoms and actually result in a child that appears extremely compliant and very responsible and very engaged. And that doesn't mean that there's not things going on below the surface. It could be simply a child who has learned a coping strategy that masks some of their symptoms. And maybe because when they experienced symptoms in the past, it was not in a safe environment. It was actually in a shaming environment that pushed a lot of that response deep inside and below the surface. So be aware not just of the kids who might pop more to the forefront because they're experiencing behaviors that we kind of call problematic, but also the kids who might be falling a little bit into the background because they are responding in what's more socially acceptable ways. And again, just emphasizing the need as caregivers and as parents and adults to approach any child with curiosity and just a sense of presence, just a willingness to be with this kiddo right where they're at with whatever they're experiencing. And that's going to go such a long way towards creating that foundation of safety, relational connection with this kiddo. But we were just getting ready to talk about what we can do to help kids recover. And so it looks like we're going to have to dig deeper into that in part 2 of the webinar, which is coming up in August. But we just really appreciate the questions that each of you have submitted through our time together. Mel and Diane have lots of experience with some really key healing modalities to help move kids through that open door of recovery and restoration, like Melanie mentioned earlier. Again, we just want to remind you that there will be an email in your inbox with a survey. We do shape our discussions and webinar conversations based on your feedback. We had several surveys submitted from the webinar we did on Friday, and we shaped today's webinar based on that. So your advice and suggestions is so important. We deeply appreciate the time that you take to complete these surveys. I think if you don't receive that email, then that means your spam filter has kicked out our email provider, and that also means you won't receive the recording link. So make sure that you check your inbox, check your junk filter, and if you have not received the survey link, please let us know and we'll make sure that that gets to you and that the second email with the additional resources gets to you as well.
Diane, Melanie, any concluding thoughts?
Just want to say thank you, and the things you were talking about being present, really present with the child that is in front of you, whatever their behaviors are. We really concur with that, being the place to start for their healing.
Absolutely.
Well, both Mercy Ministries and the Resilience Resource do private consulting as well. So if you have personal questions, feel free to contact us through our different websites. Also, for further resourcing, the Resilience Resource has a Helping Children in Crisis course that is available through our events calendar on our website, and that is available on demand. So feel free to go check that one out as well.
Well, we look forward to seeing you in August for those of you that choose to join, and just been a pleasure and a joy to be together today. So thank you for each one of you that jumped on the webinar, and we look forward to connecting again soon.